Okay. So we're very pleased tonight to have Professor Ben Fleming with us to talk about uh, history of women's rights in the U.S. Professor Fleming teaches public international law, international human rights law, and a seminar on human rights of women at South Texas College of Law in Houston. And he also teaches undergraduate courses in law at the University of Houston. And uh, he is an inaugural member of the advisory board and teaches human rights courses for Spring University in Myanmar. I was very impressed with that, Dr. Fleming, or Professor Fleming. He was associate adjunct professor of international and public affairs, international human rights law, and capstone coordinator of the Graduate School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. In 2015, he founded and co-leads the University Human Rights Education in Myanmar project, which trained law and international relations faculty throughout Burma, and which was housed at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University. He was a visiting lecturer in international human rights and public international law at Mandalay University School of Law in Myanmar in 2014. Mr. Fleming was a legal officer in the Office of the Co-Investigating Judges at the United Nations Khmer Rouge Tribunal from 2006 to 2009, where he authored the court's first indictment and was lead legal investigator for all of the five accusations.
5 accused.
He also works at the Anti-Corruption and Litigation Office of Open Society Justice Institute Initiative. And Professor Fleming, we're very pleased to have you here, and we're anxious to hear what you have to say. We do have a hard deadline at 7:30, so we would encourage you to leave some time at the end so we could ask some questions.
Well, thank you. Thank you very kindly, and I'll try to be brief because I also have another engagement at 8. So that was a mouthful. I appreciate it. Good evening, everyone. I'm happy to be here. Ramadan Karim to any of our Muslim brothers and sisters who might be with us. I know it's a tough time on the third day of fasting. Now, I just want to get this out of the way because when it comes to women's rights and women's issues, my visage is not one that you might naturally conjure up. I understand and accept that, and the women who attend my seminar often look quite shocked when they see that Professor Fleming is this. So I'll try to give a condensed version of why I'm here and how it came to be quite briefly. First and foremost, I'm born and reared right here in Houston, Texas. Born in Montgomery County in Conroe, but been in Houston since 1980. Although I did leave at 18 and never planned on coming back. But life intervenes in the best laid of plans. Happy to be with Clear Lake. My brother-in-law is from Clear Lake, a proud graduate of Clear Creek High School. I had family in Clear Lake as well, great uncles. So very fond of the area. So in 2004, I showed up at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and I was placed in the office of the prosecution. And just by happenstance, I was placed in a team that was the very first to try and prosecute and investigate rape and sexual violence as a tool in genocide. It was a brand new sort of claim. And I became, despite my very junior position at the time, incredibly involved because my superior in the office happened to be away on parental leave. She was having twins. So for that reason, I was placed where a woman probably would have been in the first place. I found out very quickly about the prevalence and the stigma associated with sexual violence on both the side of the victim and on the side of the perpetrator. Nobody wanted to talk about it, and the law itself is not designed to handle that type of crime. Then when I transitioned from international criminal law to human rights, I moved to Burma, and with Columbia University, I was trying to find a vehicle for change, and very quickly hit upon legal education because it had the capacity to reach exponentially further than most projects, because we could train trainers who would then have access to all of the law students in all of the departments across the country. What I found, though, surprised me, because in Burma, for historical reasons, mostly bad, the entire legal education sector is composed of women. 99.5% of all law professors in Burma are women. So I didn't have to work on breaking the glass ceiling for women because they were already there. It was a different challenge, and it was trying to regain esteem for the legal profession itself. So I was trying to elevate a field that in most places is quite elevated. Y'all have given me more esteem than I probably merit just because I have the title of professor of law. That doesn't work in Burma, but that's what we were trying to change. And then finally, as I began my foray into teaching, for family reasons, we were forced to move back home to Houston. I had just begun teaching at Columbia, and thank God my wife made more money than I did, but I still needed to live. And so I just walked into South Texas College of Law and said, hey, I don't see anybody teaching human rights. Would you allow me to teach it? And they said, sure, why not? And within about 3 weeks, I said, well, no one's teaching women's rights either. Why is that? And they said, nobody wants to. And needing the money, I said, I'll do it. And those last two very quickly demonstrated to me the practical effects of what placing the word woman means in front of anything. As soon as you place that word in front of the issue, it becomes siloed, it becomes ghettoized, it becomes subordinate. I didn't feel comfortable teaching it. I've had 100 students in my seminar, my women's rights seminar. How many of them do you think have been men? 0. In 8 years, I've had 0 men in my class. Won't surprise you that at an institution even like the United Nations, there are almost no male applicants in UN Women, despite them having a very broad remit, same pay, that UN jobs are scarce and highly competitive. And yet we have equal applications by sex and gender for every other institute within the United States, be that race, be that UNICEF, Human Rights Council, what have you. They're much more poorly funded, and their power with the institution is less. We read about these things in sort of the scholarly work, but in practical terms, this is where it really hit me. And I still find it very difficult for me to say that I teach women's rights. I think it's more accurate to say that I advise. I participate and work with women in assessing the relationship between law and women's issues, and I mostly learn as it turns out. So I'm just going to talk for a little bit, and I don't mind being interrupted, and I will leave time for questions, but I've always preferred a more Socratic approach. So please, if you'd like to interrupt and have me clarify or say something, just speak up. I'm exercising my professorial prerogative as well and changing my topic ever so slightly, despite this being Women's History Month, and the importance of noting that most of the really important things in history for women are not what's generally presented. in generalized histories. I'm talking about Seneca Falls. I'm talking about the 19th Amendment. I'm talking about the creation of the birth control pill in 1957, the first female American president. That hasn't happened yet, actually. So, but despite the importance of that, we find ourselves maybe unhappily living in interesting times. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about what's going on now. And I think my intuition, and from what I gather, especially from students and just from participating in society, is that we have these two competing and seemingly opposing narratives when it comes to women in the United States. The first being that women are thriving, and the second that women are miserable. And how can we reconcile those two notions at the same time? What are the evidence? What's the evidence for these claims? For the first, for the idea that women are thriving, there's plentiful statistics, right? You can talk about the fact that women outstrip men as graduates at almost every level now, higher average test scores. From the year 2000 to present, the number, for example, of women medical doctors, MDs, is up almost 100%, and they now compose nearly 40% of the medical profession. That holds true almost exactly in law, although in law now women outstrip men as law students. They're the majority of law students. The percentage of women in the highest earning brackets is steadily increasing. It's at 35%. In 1980, when I was a young boy, that was only about 18%. So in many ways, it's inarguable that it's the best possible time to be born a woman, especially in the United States. And yet there's a very real backlash to this success. And when we say that women are miserable, it's not a claim that I'm necessarily making. If you saw the Barbie movie, the most famous line from that is that it's impossible to be a woman. I'm not sure that the present company will feel that way. I think by and large, women, especially older women, can contextualize and have the broad-sightedness to understand over long term that it's a good time to be a woman, even though there are certainly challenges, especially now. But what's really going on, it seems to me, is that young girls, and young women are demonstrably feeling worse about the idea of becoming a woman. That womanhood itself is not something that they particularly are looking forward to. There's reports that are quite widespread that you might be aware of, that more than half of all girls experience or report extreme depressive symptoms, that self-esteem amongst girls is plummeting, despite the counterindication facts of how well they're doing vis-a-vis males and boys. And it seems that it's womanhood that they're afraid of. Now, this is purely anecdotal, but it's worth what it is. In my seminar this year, 100% of the women in my class view pregnancy as a disability rather than an ability, That the ability to give birth is a disability and not a strength or an ability. And I cannot change their minds by hook or by crook. It's not my job necessarily to do so, but it's very revealing. And it's changed since the very first time I taught the seminar, where it was almost the complete opposite. So how do we account for some of these things? This recognition, I think, that for both better and worse, it means the education system and the awareness and the self-awareness is growing, but what's growing is their notion that they're not getting a fair deal, and that the backlash to their success is both visceral and felt like real life felt amongst young girls, whether that's the rise of these men's rights activists and these kind of goofballs who are trying to take things back. The fact that we just reelected a known sex offender into the highest office, those things are felt. If we look locally and we think about, say, something like reproductive rights, since SB 8 was brought into effect in 2021, SB 8 being the bill that reduced the time when you could have an abortion to 6 weeks to where we are now, where it's almost a complete ban on abortion. Life-threatening infections for mothers are up 50%. Maternal mortality is up 51% in Texas. From the 2 years preceding the ban until the ban was put in place. And what's absolutely unconscionable, and which we should all be talking about with our elected officials, is that in Harris County, Harris County leads the entire nation, all of the United States, in maternal death rates for Black women. Harris County is also home to what? The largest medical center on the planet Earth. How can it possibly be the case that we are both of those things at once? And if that's not a political issue, if that's not a legal issue that has to be driven home and forced to change, then I'm not sure I know what one is. The public-private divide, which has always caused a problem in terms of domestic violence and intimate partner violence, and that reveals very clearly that the law itself was not designed to protect women. It was not made for women. We've always had to reinterpret it to work for women. It was never created to protect women's interests. When we think about, say, physical violence between men, where does that occur? Generally in public, at a bar, at a place, at some place open, which means that there's witnesses, there's cameras, there's this, there's that. Where women face violence is in the sanctity of the home. It's cliche at this point, but the most dangerous place in the world for a woman is in her home. That's proved true for generations and generations. We have stand your ground. We have your home as your castle. We have higher penalties for burglary over robbery, right? Because it violates the sanctity of the home. We have these competing interests, right? So because privacy and the home is what drives our inability in the law to react to violence against women. And yet it's the exact same foundation we use in law to protect women when it comes to reproductive choice, contraception, and those things. Those are all founded on the constructed right of privacy that we come through the Constitution. So we're fighting a battle from both ends. We both cannot and must defend privacy to protect women, and it becomes a very muddy discourse when you're trying to pass meaningful legislation or policies to account for these types of harm that women face. I think we also face a disaggregation of expertise. I'm not sure if you guys feel it. I hear a lot of people talk about it in circles that I operate in, that all expertise has become so niche that nobody can tell the generalized story anymore. And I think this is incredibly important and difficult because women are almost impossible to essentialize. And when I say essentialize, I hope you know what that means is to come up with a common characteristic, what it means to define women. So for most of the women's rights movement, women fought against being essentialized. There is no singular woman. There is no thing that makes a woman, or that can be the defining characteristic. That was often used in history to subordinate women. And so the fight was always to recognize women as individuals outside of their sex. And yet now, it is almost impossible to find women who would consider sex to be their primary identity marker. What do I mean when I say that? I mean that you identify more strongly communally with another group rather than with the group that is the biggest majority on the planet, women. So whether that's race or ethnicity, whether that's religion, whether that's language, whether that's politics or social class, occupation, ability, disability, those are the groups for which we organize politically. Those are the ones that we identify with within our community. So when these issues, when these rights come into conflict, even in something as disparate as, say, indigenous rights and women, well, when protecting an indigenous group confronts the fact that the indigenous group might have a practice that is harmful to women, the women's issue always falls by the wayside. Black women might not want to report domestic violence because they understand very intuitively that the incarceration of male Black men is a huge problem, probably defining problem of their community. And so if they report violence against themselves by their intimate partners, it leads and feeds into the incarceration problem that faces their community. If an undocumented woman is a victim of violence, she's not going to report for different reasons, right? Because she might lose the breadwinner, there might be deportation, there might be any number of repercussions that present as more pressing. And so the ability to organize on sex becomes difficult because it's a classic sort of divide and conquer. And because violence against women in all of its forms is a phenomenon that crosses all classes, all races, all ethnicities almost equally, we have a very difficult time unifying that voice. There is no factor that distinguishes prevalence of violence against women in any community. So wealthy, white, of color, any of those things, where you're from, religion, race, every single one of those communities, every one of those identity markers has almost, they're variable, but they're very closely close in their rates of domestic violence or violence against women. The only real indicator that we know of for sure is persistent unemployment, but that's not necessarily persistent unemployment and poverty. There are plenty of wealthy people that are persistently unemployed, and those rates of violence are equal to those on the bottom end. When we think about a state and its ability, a state, I mean a big state here, like a country, and its ability to respond to the plague of domestic violence. In the United States alone, we have around 13,000 victims of domestic violence homicide, meaning domestic violence that ends in actual death of the woman. That's 3 September 11ths every year. That has happened for 50 years or more. Now think about the state resources we moved in response to 9/11. And then think about what we are capable or not capable of moving to counter violence against women. Now, when we actually look at the reality of that, for every woman killed in a domestic violence homicide in the United States, 9 more are nearly killed. So we go from 1,300 to almost 120,000 every year. And a great number of those women would prefer to have died, who end up being paralyzed, quadriplegic, traumatic chronic brain injuries, those sorts of things that cost the American economy, if we have to put them in those terms instead of human terms, trillions of dollars in the long run. And yet we don't or cannot seem to muster the political will to channel resources in the way that we would for classical understandings of things that threaten our state.
Question.
Please.
How does that correlate with guns? In the number
I'm
of
glad you
murders or
asked.
victims?
So this is something I was sort of working my way towards. If I can just do one more point before I circle around, because I am headed towards that. I'd like to ask, maybe rhetorically, but what is the leading cause of maternal mortality in the United States?
Lack of health care.
Nope, it's a good guess. So we have,
Guns,
go ahead. It's not
firearms.
guns per se, but it's guns in a backward sort of way. The leading cause of maternal mortality in the United States is homicide suicide. So it's deliberate killing of a pregnant woman. More than sepsis, more than infection, more than preeclampsia, more than cardiac events, it is murder, homicide. That's true in Houston as well, and Harris County as well. Now, the statistics don't always pick it up cleanly because that's not considered a medical issue. It's not maternal mortality in medicine. They don't pick up on those statistics. But from the ages of 15 to 44, for a pregnant woman, during pregnancy and up to 42 postnatal days, leading cause is murder-suicide. That's an astounding statistic. And the vast majority of those deaths, and here's where we circle around to, are related to violence. This is another issue that we have when we talk about the relationship of women and the law. So we all know that there is, at least in theory, a prohibition on sex discrimination. And sex actually does include gender in US law, because Neil Gorsuch surprised all of us when he actually 2 terms ago and said that gender does in fact count as sex discrimination under Title VII. But when we look at that, the inability to discriminate based on sex can be as problematic in the law as the prohibition. What do I mean when I say that? Well, 80% of all violent crime is committed by men. 90% of all homicides are committed by men. The vast majority of those are done with the use of firearms. And yet it would be impossible under US law to prohibit gun ownership based on sex, right? But what would that do if we could use that prohibition? If we could discriminate based on sex? What the prohibition on sex discrimination does is it takes out facts. It takes our ability to discriminate based on science and facts away. It's also unlawful to discriminate and say that men don't get a vote on reproductive choice of a pregnant woman, even though it's not something they can experience. It's not germane to them, at least physically, to their physical autonomy and self as it is to women. And yet they have equal say because you can't discriminate based on sex. So we have these, and please don't go away saying Professor Fleming thinks that prohibition on sex discrimination is bad. I don't, but some of the cardinal things that we understand in law, in rights, even something that's sacred as the presumption of innocence, how does that harmful to women? Is it? Well, when you think about domestic violence or sexual violence, and we think about what I said about public and private, well, what is a man who's usually the alleged perpetrator in domestic violence or sexual violence get to do? There's no witnesses. It's a he said, she said. And especially when we're talking about domestic violence, you usually have a defendant. I mean, sorry, not a defendant, a claimant or a victim who is especially if she's been beaten severely or if she's been strangled, becomes very quickly an unreliable witness. She testifies that she was in the bedroom at this point, and then she got hit in the kitchen. And then the next version, she says that no, it was in the kitchen and then he has the right to cross-examination. And any lawyer worth their salt can create reasonable doubt in that situation. So conviction becomes nigh impossible. But the presumption even though the science and the statistics say that the presumption is absolutely wrong when it comes to domestic violence, that claims of false domestic violence, this myth, this theory that a woman is trying to collect on the wealthy husband or get his assets or whatever else, have proven continuously to be almost minuscule. False accusations of, for example, in the UK is the best study, and there was like a 5-year study, there was 2, and neither one of them were ever prosecuted and then convicted. And we're talking like 2 out of like 200,000. That's a myth, but we're not allowed in law because of these cardinal rules to allow science and facts to permit us discrimination in the same way that we react against ideas like affirmative action or special measures for women in terms of violence. We are not allowed, according to the Supreme Court, to have a set number of women who are appointed to or elected in Congress, for example. Some countries have done that. It's not particularly effective. I'm not saying it's a good way to do it. But there are things that we know and we can demonstrably show with evidence, or do a good deal towards solving some of the more pressing issues. With the gun violence thing, again, I'm borrowing terms and statistics from a woman named Rachel Louise Snyder, who wrote a very seminal book called No Visible Bruises. She uses the word drama kings. When we talk about mass shootings, I know I had one very recently that was committed by a young woman or a young girl, but 99% committed by men. But what people fail to understand, you guys will be of most of us in the audience will have running. What's the grandfather of mass shootings in the United States? It's the UT Tower shooting, right? That's the one that sort of kicked it off. He killed 17 people, wounded 30 more. How did that start? He stabbed to death both his wife and his mother the day before. And 55% of all mass shootings start as domestic violence incidents. So when we think about mass shootings, which obviously involve firearms, it's very rarely talked about. This is also a gendered crime, that more than half of them start with a domestic violence incident and usually result in the death. The famous DC sniper case, the father and son sniper case that happened 15 or something years ago, began as the whole thing was a ruse to cover up the original domestic violence, the original killing of the mother. This is often the case. So the ability to restrict gun ownership, the inability to restrict it, as it happens here and in most of the United States, is a hugely gendered issue. What we do instead is we encourage women to purchase guns as a security blanket, as a response. But what that is doing is telling women to be like men. It's perpetrating a male standard. So to thrive in the United States, you have to operate the way that a man does, even though it's demonstrably clear that the way that men behave in the United States is not something to be emulated. The myths that we see, and I'll close with this and we'll start talking about taking questions, but I always like talking to my students about it. So what is our closest relative? What is our closest animal relative on the planet?
Ape.
Apes, monkeys.
Yeah, which kind?
Bonobo.
Well, we got a false start on what I'm talking about. Usually we get chimpanzee, right?
Yeah.
That's the classic one. So we got the horse going before the cart here, but that's okay. But chimpanzees operate how? They operate in patriarchal societies, warring tribes. And when we study anthropology, this becomes naturalized, that the male is the hunter, the female is the gatherer, that female subordination is natural in nature. What most people don't often know is the forgotten bonobo, who is equally related to the male species. exact same DNA difference as a chimpanzee and a human. But what is bonobo society? Bonobo society is matriarchal. Problems and communal problems are not solved through violence. They're not through warring with other tribes. The predominant means by which disputes are settled in bonobo society is sexual gratification of the matriarch by the subordinate male, or by multiple subordinate males, which might go a long way to changing the mood amongst humans. That's all to say that this idea, this patriarchy, all this stuff is constructed. It's not natural, and confirmation bias, especially in science, has led us to believe or to allow this notion that we don't have a choice in these things. So we only have a few choices in terms of law. Law is a limited vehicle for changing these things, but if we can't throw out the entirety of it and do a complete radical transformation, then we have to be really creative in our interpretation of the law as it exists. How can we interpret it in ways that can respond to the real practical life problems that women face in our society? And that's a challenge that we have. For our purposes, not just in relation to women, but to try to end on some sort of happy note, I think is what we're doing now, is being in communion with one another. That collective action is really the only way that we can do anything meaningful. And I don't mean that just for good and bad. So one of the things we've been talking a lot lately about is even something like grief, which in Western society is generally thought of as a private endeavor, as something that we do privately. In indigenous cultures, that's the opposite. All grief is communal. And I think in the times that we're at now, and I think a lot of people are feeling a lot of grief, that if we do these things communally, if we commit to numbers, if we commit to linking our issues to the issues of others, just as Leticia was bringing us into environmental and clean air issues, how can we correlate and find common issue linkages with that and the other frameworks under which Amnesty International members operate and think about? That those bridging of those gaps, those findings of things to bring in common, allow larger and larger organized communities to precipitate change. And with that, I'll stop. I hope that was at least interesting in some way.
It was
quite
great. It was great.
excellent.
great.
Very good.
Yeah, please, if there's any questions out there, I'd be pleased to answer.
Yeah,
I
I
have-
suggest people raise their hand if they can.
Oh,
Go ahead, Julie.
okay. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I apologize. Well, I actually have like two questions. I'll try and make it brief. First, on the gun issue, how effective do you think red flag laws are? And is this something we should be pushing more for? And the second one is, how do you deal with otherwise intelligent, knowledgeable women who continue to vote, not just vote, but fight against their own best interests? I mean, a lot of the information. Okay, I'll be frank. My sister is a social worker and a very intelligent woman, and she cares very much about her jobs. But when I mentioned to her the abnormally high death rate in our country for maternal death rate in our country, she chooses to disbelieve it. She says that's fake news. How do you deal with people like that?
Let's start out with the easy questions, huh? How do I deal with that? First, with the red flag, to my mind, any legislation, at least here in Texas, would be useful. It's been pretty clearly demonstrated that laws that permit confiscation of firearms at compulsory taking of firearms at domestic violence incidents save lives and reduce rates greatly. We don't have those here. the thing about the law and red flags is the implementation system. So however you set up the system is going to matter. So one of the real big problems with domestic violence and say protective orders, whether they're permanent or temporary, is it's a state's issue, and there's no required database, and there's nothing like that. So if I am a serial abuser that has permanent or both permanent and temporary restraining orders on me, and say I'm in Vidor, Texas, as soon as I cross into Louisiana, that disappears. So if I'm pulled over with a woman with a bloody lip, they have no way of knowing that I have this on my case. And yet we can and do have a system that works when it comes to DUIs, because that's considered interstate and it becomes a federal issue. So because criminal law is the preserve of states and interstate issues are the preserve of the federal government, we have a federal database, and you can cross state lines and be tracked for DUI, but you can't be tracked for violence against women. So the system is always going to matter as much as the specific legislation of the red flag. I'm not an expert on gun rights issues, but at least here, anything's a start. I mean, we don't have very much at all. When it comes to women voting against their self-interest, we get into very sort of prickly areas. Accusations of women acting out of their best interests or not knowing their best interests are legion in history and have been a manner of subordination of women for a long time. I'm not sure exactly how to go about it. The fake news phenomenon is a reflection, is a reflective thing that everybody says now. More so on one side than the other side, obviously, but I know people on all sides of the political spectrum that will immediately resort to that. When this guy killed the healthcare executive, most liberals that I know that are in my circle, and I count myself among the liberals, immediately their reflexive attitude was this is a state, this is a fake, this is something that they planted in order to get the right story out there. So that's a problem with everyone. That's the proliferation of the media and the lack of gatekeepers in media, which has been both good and bad. All of these things are both good and bad. But this is also what I was talking about with the inability to tell coherent stories anymore, because there's such niche expertise pockets that we talk over each other, and my niche expertise doesn't necessarily fit with the story of your expertise, and rather than commonalities, we focus on difference. That part is troublesome. Not really answering your question, but how do I personally deal with that? To be honest, it might be just black humor and alcohol, at least at family events, you know, but try to be patient. I try to be kind. And I try to just, what I generally do, especially at a family function, is I try to write down a couple of anecdotes that are revelatory, that try to dismantle known talking points that I know are coming. But that takes a lot of work and a lot of effort. And sometimes we're just too tired, and I'm not going to expect anybody to be able to do it all the time.
Okay, Louisa, I saw you had your hand up previously.
I
Please.
did. Yeah, I used to live in Houston for a long time, worked at NASA, and I know all these guys, some of these folks here. So I'm the kind of the lost member over here in Colorado. But everything you said just resonated loudly with me. I think of my mother. You know, I'm a senior, and my mother was a traditional at-home mom, and she tried to break out and not be that, and work. And that was frowned upon. So when I grew up, my first objective was I'm going to college and I'm moving away, you know. And so you work that, and I always feel like, you know, a lot of what you say resonates so well because you feel like you have your feet in two different worlds. you want to please and you want to be approved of in one world, and the other world is what you desire, what you wish, how you'd like to expand. And when I look at young women now, I see the same thing happening. They are who they are, and you know, collectively, when they're supportive of each other, I see them being the best they can be when they trust each other and help each other. But when they step out into the you know, the workplace, for example, they have to turn into something else, and it's just this flip-flopping of trying to meet all these different requirements, standards, needs, whatever, that I think is just so emotionally
Yeah,
challenging.
I think that girls, especially now, they, in a way that former generations couldn't, they can articulate what's happening to them, and they understand that they're getting a raw deal. They understand that their perspective is outpacing cultural change, right? So they understand that. So I'll give a quick little thing because I think it reveals what I'm trying to talk about. They did a massive study on men and domestic violence homicide, which I was talking about earlier. And they looked at, the hypothesis was that men who committed domestic violence homicide did less housework, did less care work, did less all of those things than men who didn't. And that's absolutely false. Men who commit domestic violence homicide and general men did the same exact level of housework, childcare, elder care, et cetera, et cetera. The only difference between those two groups was that the men who didn't commit domestic violence homicide knew they were getting a good deal, and the domestic violence homicide committers were consistently saying, well, I do more than most men. You should be grateful to me because I do this. And I think most young women can articulate the fact that I know when I become a mother, when I become a wife, that comes along with having to be twice as good to succeed in my career, but also that I'll do 33% more childcare. I'll do 30 to 50% more elder care, and I'll have to do 20 to 40% more domestic responsibilities. So why would I want to be that? Why would I accept that? And I know it's not going to change. It is changing ever so slowly, but culture always changes more slowly than knowledge or comprehension. And so I think they're faced with that. It's not changing fast enough, and they're more aware of it than former generations. So who's that up there with is that Howard? You got a question?
Do you think that the recent Supreme Court decision on whether a domestic abuser could carry firearms might begin to change the gun debate, give us a little bit more capability?
Sure. Like I said, any step is a good step. So I applaud that happened. One of the major problems, and I don't want to be bashing too many communities at one time. I know that governance is hard and protection and policing is hard. But one of the most striking situations when it comes to domestic violence is that domestic violence rates are almost 3 times higher amongst police officers than they are amongst law enforcement, than they are amongst the civilian population. So we have a body responding whose job is to respond to the very types of situations that they in fact commit at a rate almost 3 times higher than those who they're responding to. One of the most famous sort of cases in this in U.S. Supreme Court history is called Gonzalez versus Castle Rock, and it was in the news fairly recently, as we'll all remember, because of Uvalde, right? Saying that police they have discretion, and so they're not required to respond to a violation of a restraining order or have to go into a building to protect children. That because law enforcement has discretion and the operation of how they pick and choose what they're going to do, that it can't be a property right that an individual can sue the government for. Now, if that's the case, then these PROs and TROs and gun legislation aren't really worth what they're talking about. So we have to find extra legal means. It's not just the legislation. There's nothing wrong with the legislation you mentioned in theory, but you have to both legislate and then implement in a meaningful way that legislation. So if we don't train the force that's supposed to do it, to actually enforce it, and we don't have a registry, right? We have it's a bit difficult and rich to say that you can confiscate firearms if you don't know who has all the firearms, and we don't. And that problem is escalating with ghost guns and the ability to 3D print guns and those. So yes, it's a step in the right direction. And I applaud that the Supreme Court was willing to do anything in relation to the Second Amendment in that direction. So I don't want to poo-poo it, but I also don't think it's any sort of panacea.
There were 2 points I wanted to make. One was there's a book called Nexus that I've been holding up to people too, if they really want to talk about the internet and miscommunications. And the point he makes is every time you get a revolution in information, you get all sorts of people pulling all sorts of shit. And the classic example he makes is that when the printing press comes on, there's massive pamphlets printing not of the Bibles, but of the witch hunter's guides. And all sorts of things go nuts.
Howard, I
so that
think I'd like to let one more woman get a question
Go
in.
ahead. My apologies. My apologies.
Is there another question?
Oh, I have one, if it's okay.
Please.
Okay, Julie.
Okay, is there a piece of legislation that you would like us to focus on?
I mean, I think I'm not sure I can identify a single one. And so this is also something that I'd like to say, and I have to thank you guys on the way out, is that my whole career has been international. And when I met Muhammad at a wedding and he asked me to do this, it's finally occurred to me, despite being home for almost 8, 9 years at this point, that I am home for good, and that I have to start engaging more locally. And so that's part of my project. So I wish I could answer that in a meaningful way, but I am only just recently plugging back into sort of more domestic and more local issues. There are plenty of organizations that I can point you to that would be able to talk about those things. And if somebody will remind me and send me an email, I can send a list of some of those organizations who focus on these issues locally.
Okay, I will do that. Very good. We really have run out of time, but I would give Howard a chance to finish what he was saying since I interrupted him, and then we'll call it quits.
The other thing that I was going to bring out was there's a scene in the movie Gettysburg where a Union officer asks his sergeant, "What do you think of Negroes?" And the sergeant says, "Well, sir, I cannot really tell you. You cannot judge a race. You have to take people as individuals, one at a time." And I'm wondering if that might be a basis in law, if you could get the law to treat each person as an individual with those individual characteristics rather than thinking of them as groups, we could make more progress. Enough said.
Maybe that's true. I think when it comes to particular gender typed of violence, though, if we're trying to think about sexual assault, for example, I'm not sure how much it counts to think about the individual, especially from the victim side. The commonalities between the victims and the perpetrators are statistically significant, right? Who's committing it and who's not. So most of the time, I think that's right. And the last thing I'll say is, because race is always, this is particular to the United States especially, but it's true in international law too, that we treat race and sex very differently. The United States has ratified the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, but refuses to ratify the exact same Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of of discrimination against women. They're almost identical, but why is it that the government can interfere in private affairs when it comes to race? They could tell the Catholic Church, for example, that you're not allowed to not have Black priests, but they can't go in and say you can't have women priests, right? So we have and have always given preferred status to some designations over others, whether they merit it or not. And I'm not saying that racial discrimination is less important than any of that, or that we shouldn't do that. But why is one always privileged over the others? And on that, I've got to run. But I thank you all. It was a pleasure to be here, and I hope that was enjoyable.
This was an excellent,
Thank you.
well
you.
beyond our
Thank you.
expectations.
Very good. Thank you
Very
so
much.
Thank you very
much.
much.
Professor Fleming.
Very good. Thank
appreciate
you.
Thank you all. Have a good
Bye.
night.
Thank you.
Thing.
Thank you.
Thanks, Wally.
Yep.
Thanks, Bob.